There were not a lot of bright spots for the Green Bay Packers in between the era of Vince Lombardi as the head coach and the era of Mike Holmgren as the head coach. For roughly a quarter century, the Green Bay Packers were borderline irrelevant and were never competitors. After winning Super Bowl II in the 1967 season and up until the 1993 season, when Brett Favre truly came into his own, the Packers made it to the playoffs just twice and only had 2 seasons with at least 10 wins. Not that too many people were feeling sympathy for the Packers after they had so much success before that, having more success in a decade than most fans will ever experience with their team in their lifetime, but the Packers had very few good seasons, as the Packers of the late 60s, the 1970s, the 1980s, and the early 90s were marred with losses, uncompetitive games, and some really dumb organizational decisions that backfired in spectacular fashion. For the most part, they were an afterthought. However, without a doubt, the bright spot for the Packers during that stretch was the 1982 season, as in this season right here that you're watching. The bad news for the Packers in 1982 was that 7 of their 16 games were canceled due to the strike wiping out roughly 2 months of the year, leading to a bizarre scheduling quirk where the Packers actually played more regular season games in Milwaukee that season than they did in Green Bay. Having said that, the Packers were one of the best teams in football in 1982, finishing the year with a 5-3-1 record following an incredible 3-0 start, and finishing the year with a top 5 offense and a borderline top 10 defense in the league, with the team boasting the 3rd best record in the NFC and the 3rd highest point differential in the NFC, being one of just 3 teams in the conference that year, oddly enough, with a point differential greater than 5. And to top it all off, they won their first round game against the St. Louis Cardinals, hosting their first playoff game in over a decade and a half, and winning their first playoff game since the Super Bowl all those years ago. You can learn more about that game and the bizarre nature of it by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Bart Starr did not have a lot of good seasons or moments in his 9 years as the head coach of the team that he was once a quarterback on, but 1982 was a legitimately solid campaign, even if there was an asterisk attached next to it because of the bizarre nature of the season, the likes of which we hopefully never see again. Having said that, there was one player that the Packers did not have in 1982 that they could have had, but instead had to enjoy the season as a spectator. That man was this player right here, wide receiver Ron Cassidy. We'll talk about Cassidy in just a little bit and how good he was, because odds are he wouldn't have contributed much anyways for the Pack, and his numbers if he did play in 1982 would have likely been minimal at best. Heck, if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that if this is your first time ever hearing the name Ron Cassidy as an NFL player. However, in keeping Cassidy on the team, the Packers definitely cheated and did a few things that were highly illegal that the NFL, for some reason, probably because they had bigger fish to fry and bigger things to worry about with an impending strike, looked the other way on. And more than 40 years later, it deserves a deep dive today. Because if ever there was an incident in NFL history that was a blatant case of stashing a guy on the injured reserve who wasn't even remotely injured, and a case of roster manipulation, it's this moment involving this player right here in Ron Cassidy during the 1982 season. Because this is the story behind one of the craziest roster controversies in the over century-long history of the Green Bay Packers that you probably never heard of before. Make sure you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel, because we post every single day on here about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL with stories like this one that you may not have heard of before. So if you like that sort of stuff, then this is definitely the place for you. Thanks in advance for liking and subscribing, and for helping us grow this community. And with that in mind, let's talk about the time that the word injured in the phrase injured reserve was entirely optional. Before I talk about what exactly the Packers did and how insane it was, because they literally said the quiet part out loud during this, as you'll soon find out, we need some context to understand just who Ron Cassidy was, and what his likely contribution would have been in 1982 if he wasn't injured. And I use the word injured in massive air quotes. For starters, Cassidy wound up having a pretty solid career in the NFL considering where he was drafted. Cassidy was drafted out of Utah State in the 8th round of the 1979 NFL Draft. When you were drafted in the 8th round back then, you were basically a dart pick. The teams were throwing darts and just hoping that they could find anyone. A good chunk of the guys drafted in the 8th round that year didn't even play in the NFL. For Cassidy to not only play in the league, but make some solid contributions on offense and special teams at times, and play all the way until the end of the 1984 season when all was said and done, easily beating the league-wide average for player career length is pretty good. Now, that's not to say that he did much. He wasn't the greatest at catching balls in traffic or creating separation, and he never found the end zone despite all his time in the league. Still, that's not to say that he didn't have his moments, from a huge jump ball grab against the Detroit Lions during the final week of the 1979 season to all but ice the game and get them into field goal range, to a couple of nice punt returns that set the Packers up in decent field position, to a couple of catches that kept the Packers ahead of schedule and even put them in the red zone, even extending some drives along the way. Again, I'm not saying that Cassidy did much, and there was no way he was going to do much of anything in 1982, as by 1981, with the Packers having James Lofton at wideout and also acquiring the great John Jefferson from the San Diego Chargers, Cassidy barely featured on that side of the ball. But at the very least, Cassidy had a shot to be on the active team in 1982. However, he was no lock to make it by any means. It was projected that Cassidy was right on the fringe and was in danger of losing his spot on the team due to the strong performance in training camp of Philip Epps, their 12th round pick from TCU, who eventually put together a decent career with Green Bay throughout the mid-1980s. So what do you do if you have a player that you might potentially like, but not like enough to keep him on the roster? Simple. You try to stash him on the injured reserve. A player on the injured reserve doesn't count toward the roster limit, which in this case in 1982 was 49 players, with 45 being active on game day. So if the Packers wanted to put this man right here on the IR, he wouldn't have counted toward the group of 49. They could keep him for another year, not have him go to another team, and not really lose anything in the process since, again, he was probably going to be buried on the depth chart if he did make the 49, especially in two wide sets. And to be fair, Cassidy had an injury history. He missed the first 5 games of the 1981 season with a neck injury and was placed on IR before being reactivated later in the season. More on the reactivation process in just a bit, because this is where things get even more insane than they're about to get. And during the preseason in 1982, he had another injury, suffering a bruised shoulder. So, to be fair, Ron Cassidy was injured, and the Packers, knowing the likely uphill climb that Cassidy faced to make it onto the 49-man roster as it was, decided to put him on IR with that shoulder injury. As head coach Bart Starr said on the decision to place Cassidy on IR, he has a very, very tender shoulder, and he just hasn't responded. All right, so far, so good. This story seems pretty normal, all things considered. Breaking news: a player who is injured gets placed on injured reserve. Big whoop. Really stretching into game for content here, I know. And believe me, if this is where the story ended, I would 100% agree with you. If Cassidy was legitimately injured and everything that Bart Starr was saying was true, then yes, this move makes a ton of sense considering all of the circumstances. However, that's when Starr decided, for some reason, to keep speaking and to keep talking. Because then he said the quiet part out loud and openly admitted that this was roster manipulation and that Cassidy wasn't really hurt, and that this was just a way to keep him on the team without having him take up a roster spot. Because, you see, the Packers had a game later in the weekend against the New England Patriots, which was a preseason game that meant absolutely nothing in terms of the final result. In other words, it's a game where you're not playing anyone who's even the slightest bit banged up. You're not taking any chances. Yet, for some reason, Stars said that Cassidy was nearing complete health. In fact, he was so healthy that if the move wasn't made to put him on injured reserve, that he would have been good enough to suit up against the Patriots. We're going to place him on IR, but yeah, in theory, he should be good to go tomorrow. Oh, and he absolutely would have been able to play in week 1 of the regular season against the Los Angeles Rams. Once again, not me speculating, that was what Bart Starr said. No issues there. Ron Cassidy, this man right here, we're placing him on injured reserve, but he is totally healthy. He can play. He is absolutely fit and will be 100% tomorrow. And I genuinely have no idea, none whatsoever, why the heck Bart Starr would say this and admit to this. You said that you put Ron Cassidy on injured reserve because he was injured, thereby ending his season and preventing any other team from signing him. And yet, you openly tell the press, hey guys, he's not really injured. We're going to prevent him from playing in 1982 in all likelihood, but we're keeping him. And he's not able to go to any other team, all because we placed him on IR, because technically he had an injury, even though that injury is going to heal tomorrow, and he'll be at 100% in the blink of an eye. I've had sneezes that cause more pain and more lasting damage than whatever Ron Cassidy suffered with his shoulder. And yet, the Packers were blatantly stashing Cassidy to keep him when he was very clearly healthy. It'd be different if Cassidy said, I'm good to go out there, because of course he's going to say that, because football players are warriors, and they don't want to show weakness. But this is the Packers basically incriminating themselves in the dumbest way possible when they did not have to. And no one would be any wiser or know any better if they just kept their mouth shut. But hang on, because it actually gets worse. Because, you see, when a player got placed on injured reserve back then, the player had to be designated with a major or a minor injury. If you're designated with a minor injury, you're not allowed to come back for the rest of the season. This is to prevent a situation like what you're seeing right here with Ron Cassidy, where you just put any fringe player that you like, but probably will contribute for you guys that season on the injured reserve. If you're designated with a major injury, you're allowed to come back if the team wishes to reactivate you, provided that you clear waivers, giving other teams a chance to poach you, which was another way to prevent roster manipulation. Now, there wasn't really too much incentive to designate a player with a minor injury versus a major injury, because with a major injury, you could come back. A minor injury, you were done for the year. But even though there might not be a clear-cut definition of what a major injury is versus what a minor injury is, I think you know the difference. Stubbing your toe is a heck of a lot different than tearing your ACL. There might be some gray area in major versus minor, but I think you can differentiate between the two, and you can differentiate between how bad you're feeling. And I kid you not, in case this couldn't get any more obvious, guess what the Packers designated Ron Cassidy with when he was placed on injured reserve? Go on, take a guess. That's right, a major injury. Despite the fact that the Packers literally admitted that he was not hurt, that he would have been good to go for week 1 of the regular season, and would have been good to go for the team's preseason game in a couple of days, and was awfully close to 100% health, and was good enough to play, the Packers designated him with the major injury status. meaning that if the Packers wanted to, just like in 1981, provided he cleared waivers, he'd be eligible to return to the active roster later on in 1982. Yeah, this is definitely a major injury. You know what this is like? This is like the kid that tells his mom that he's too sick to go to school. He's not feeling well. He has a fever. He has a headache. He can't get out of bed. And the next thing you know, he's running laps around the house outside, kicking a soccer ball, and playing video games, all while not taking any medication in the process. Like, something isn't adding up here. The math isn't mathing. Ron Cassidy is on injured reserve with a major injury when, by your own admission, he isn't even injured. And somehow, the NFL looked the other way. Again, I had a feeling that they had way bigger fish to fry, considering the fact that the league was on the verge of shutting down for the season. And they really didn't care all that much about looking into the roster status and potential validity of an injury for a player who had one catch for 6 yards the previous season and had never found the end zone. The Packers cheating and manipulating their roster and injured reserve like this was super low on their priorities list. Almost like wanting a cop to arrest someone who's going 10 miles an hour over the speed limit when 1 mile down the road, there's an armed man holding people hostage that's already fired bullets and killed a few people. Different priorities. So the Packers were able to get away with this somehow, and were able to get away with placing a guy on injured reserve on September 1st, who by their own admission was going to be healthy on September 2nd. All while designating this as a major injury in the same vein that you designate something like a torn ACL or a broken leg. And Cassidy stayed on the Packers and played for the team in 1983 and 1984. He somehow recovered from this gruesome shoulder injury of his, with the Packers not manipulating the rules for him this time. I'm shocked. I know Comeback Player of the Year didn't exist back then, but he should have won the award if it did, because man, that is a tough injury to come back from. To be fair, this time, he didn't do much else when he returned, as he had just 2 catches for 16 yards over those 2 seasons. But his lasting legacy all these years later might just be this bizarre roster controversy, and the season that he didn't play, with that being the 1982 campaign. Look, do we want the NFL to arbitrate pain tolerance and try to read the minds of players and dictate what coaches and general managers and organizations can and cannot do when it comes to their roster and the recovery process of their players? I'm not sure there's a route that we want to go down, especially since each player recovers from an injury at a different rate, and each player plays through pain at a different threshold. However, sometimes the situations are so blatantly obvious where you don't even need to connect the dots together or put any pieces together, because the offenders literally lay it out in front of you that they're cheating, to the point where it'd be the quickest episode of Blue's Clues ever. And in a situation like this, where the team literally admitted that Cassidy was fine and could play, yet they designated him with a major injury despite his recovery time from the time he was placed on IR to the time he'd be at 100% and in playing condition, being roughly 24 hours, I don't think I need to say anything else. I really don't. Because I think it's safe to say that the 1982 season was a strange one and a very weird one in many ways for the Packers. Not just for the guys that played, but in the case of Ron Cassidy, the guys that didn't play, and not just during the strike. Check out our live streaming schedule for the next few days. We're live every single day on this channel, whether we're covering a sporting event or playing GeoGuessr or just taking your requests. So make sure you like and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single time that we go live and so that you can join this community. Also, thanks to all our members and our Patreon supporters, who get exclusive perks like their name at the end of each video, members-only Q&A streams, and cool emojis to use on videos and during streams. See how you can join this community and become a member or a Patreon member by clicking the link in the description below.